Hi, my name is Martin Purnell and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church and where we can meet and hear from those that have made their faith count. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation. You can contact us as well by email, ogc@accessradio.biz, business spelled B-I-Z. So please enjoy today's guest, who is the author of several books. He has presented on national radio and other national TV shows. Our guest was a Guinness World Record holder for the largest amount of sponsorship ever raised by an individual for a single event. He can be called an activist and has pioneered a model of community development. Our guest has raised money for healthcare in India, set up housing projects to accommodate homeless young people, and has gained many plaudits for his Oasis Academies, which deliver secondary education through the UK government's Academies programme. All this by a guest who became a Christian as a teenager and was ordained as a Baptist minister in 1981. I could go on about his career, but one of the more important personal facts, as well as being married and a father to 4 adult children, is that he's a Crystal Palace fan. Eagles. So if we run out of topics, we can always discuss his and my football team and how difficult it is to find Selhurst Park. Yeah, just say. Oh yes, and if it wasn't for his Radio Cracker initiative in the early 1990s, I might not be doing podcasts today, so you can blame him. So, what has actually motivated our guest? And what happens when he feels like giving up? How does he cope with any feedback from people that might think him controversial on a subject? What has he learned so far in his Christian faith? And what has changed from when he started out as a minister? And what would he say to those who are currently holding on to Jesus by their fingernails, especially struggling to come to terms with the Old Testament God and Jesus in the New? All these questions, so many answers no doubt coming our way. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, and I really do mean this, the Reverend Steve Chalke. Steve, thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you, Martin. That's great.
What are we speaking to you?
I'm in Waterloo at the moment, where Oasis has some offices, just near the bridge that goes across to Parliament. We've had offices around here for years and years and years, and I don't want to get too serious because it's important to be in touch with government and in their ear, fighting for the things that need fighting for, etc. But also there's a huge amount of poverty south of the river here. It's the biggest single area of poverty that close to Parliament. And so we run a children's centre, a primary school, a secondary school, a community centre, a drop-in centre, the local library, and a church here.
Wow. But apart from that, not a lot.
I used to lead the church for 20 years. I don't now anymore. But yeah, well, and the reason I say 20 years, it takes a long time to build those things.
I bet it does. And no doubt we'll hear about that later on. Also, every time you say Oasis, I keep thinking of Noel and Liam. So give them our regards when you see them.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened was, when I say I don't want to talk about me because Oasis is thousands of people working in this country and other countries. Yeah. But it so happened I began it. And so it was just me. I'll tell you about this perhaps later on. But I knew that I needed to start some housing, some education and some healthcare. And so I left my job working for a church and with my wife worked to set up a house for kids who would otherwise be on the streets. And as we got that open, my wife said to me, it's like we're providing Oasis for these kids here. Why don't we call it Oasis? So we started a charity called Oasis. And the reason it's called Oasis is for that. And then a few years later, about 5 years later, the band came along and it got really difficult. But then there was a drink called Oasis, probably still out there, and endless other things. But then the band disappeared. Then it made a comeback. Of course, at one stage, I thought, oh, blimey, we'll have to change our name. But the truth is that we seem to come through all of that and it's all okay. But that's where the name Oasis came from.
And of course, there was a Christian band called Oasis originally as well, featuring a previous guest on Off-Grid Christianity. Great stuff. Well, let's go for the first 5 questions, if that's right, Steve, and then we'll see where we end up. And I'm really looking forward to this. Question number 1. If you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask them questions, who would it be, please, Steve?
Can I have 2 people?
Yes.
Well, it would be my grandfathers.
Wonderful.
I've never met either of my grandfathers. I'm half Indian, half English. My Indian grandfather died on the ship after the end of the Second World War. You know, like the Windrush generation from the West Indies. Well, there was an equal thing for India. You know, India had been part of the British Empire and it was come over here and help rebuild the mother country. And my dad came with his parents on a boat at the end of the 40s, but his dad died on the way. So I never met that grandfather. My other grandfather, my mother's dad, he died when I was very, very young. So I'm adrift because I know little or nothing about even my grandfather's lives. One on the subcontinent of India, one working in the docks down in Medway in Kent. And I always regret that. And I think if only I could spend one evening with the two of them, I'd know so much more about life and so much more about myself.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you. And of course, we need to know that when they come round, because in my time machine, I can bring them back for you. You have to cook them a meal. So we're going to cook them.
Oh, well, that would be difficult because one dad was Indian. I kind of like his favorite. Well, my favorite meal in the world is dal curry because my dad used to cook great dal curry, which is very unlike the British version of the thing.
But it is.
So I know that my Indian dad would love curry. And my other grandfather coming from Chatham, probably fish and chips. He worked on the docks. So I don't know. We'd have to have curried fish and chips, I suppose.
Brilliant. I have to say, I love fish and chips, but you can just take it that extra soup on, can't you, by getting a carton of curry sauce and pouring it over your fish. Good call. Like it. Question 2, Steve. Who is your favourite biblical character or favourite biblical story or favourite parable, please?
Well, it's an easy question to answer that. It's Genesis chapter 1, the first story of creation. You know that the first story of creation is the poem, what happened on the first day, the second day, the third day, etc. Then there's another creation story, the second creation story, which is the Adam and Eve one. Not the same story, not a continuation of them. If you read them carefully, you'll see that they're two different accounts of creation that explain it in different ways. In actual fact, they kind of contradict one another if you read them closely. But Genesis chapter 1, I think, is a beautiful poem. And because I've studied it, I know how relevant it is to life for us. And the thing that I've given my life to, which is social justice, inclusion, equality, I know that comes from Genesis chapter 1. The story of Genesis goes adrift as the history goes on. But if it could be anchored back in the truths of that great poem that we know as Genesis chapter 1, we wouldn't have gone astray. I'm sure that will crop up through our conversation.
And I'm sure it's cropped up in several conversations in the past as well. Yeah. Question 3. If you're Prime Minister for the day and could change any law or impose new law, and I'll take a frivolous one as well, what would it be?
Well, I'll start with the frivolous one. I wish that I could impose a law where they installed a truth machine in Parliament. And if politicians exaggerate or lie or say something that they don't actually believe themselves, this big red buzzer would go off to keep them on the straight and narrow. I think we do well as a democracy if people had to tell the truth, not exaggerate, not mislead. And I think it would hold them, and it would be good for us, and it would be good for them.
Can I just adapt that buzzer thing, actually, and make it like a swingometer? And, of course, every time they lie or something, it goes round and round. Of course, if it goes really, really fast, you've actually given them an air conditioning unit because it's going so fast as well.
Because it always amazes me how when politicians aren't in power, they were dead against something, and then they're in power and they're dead for it. So I always want to know, were you not really against it and always for it? Or are you really against it, but only saying you're for it because your job depends on it? I don't know.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to know all that kind of thing, wouldn't it? But I don't suppose we're about to introduce a law that puts them all under a truth drug or, a lie detector. So this plays into, there's so many things, but I think that we need the wholesale reform of the education system. And I think that Ofsted, which is the school's inspector, needs to be either abolished and a new body set up, or Ofsted needs to be wholly reformed to come to a place where it works collaboratively with school staff down on the ground, instead of, at the moment, I think sometimes Ofsted can be great. It depends who you get, because it's inconsistent. It can be patronizing. It can not understand childhood development or the context of a particular community. And I think that creates huge amounts of stress for any school being inspected. And we all know the tragic story of Ruth Perry, the head teacher who took her life.
Yeah.
But I have yet to meet an educationalist at any level whose stress level doesn't go through the roof when Ofsted are on the way. And I don't think there's any reason for that. And of course, schools need to be inspected and there needs to be regulation, of course, but it needs to be collaborative. It needs to be about colleagues working together and all going away with jobs to do so that we offer the best to kids. That's what I would change.
Fantastic. I think you might have more chance of getting a drug test through for the MPs than that one, but it's a great answer. Question 4. Outside of family events, what has been your most enjoyable day out so far, please, Steve?
But you've already talked about it because you said I'm a Palace fan. I ought to tell you, I'm actually a patron of the charity. But the most enjoyable day ever, well, actually, there were 2. There was the day in May when we won the FA Cup. I've been a Palace fan all my life. And we, for the first time, we won. It's the first time we won anything. And then, of course, that was in May. And then in August, went back to Wembley and we beat Liverpool and won the Charity Shield.
Yeah.
And tonight, we're playing in Europe. Yeah.
And hopefully someone's going to fly you over in their private jet so you can see the game.
Honestly, the joy of those 2 days. And I don't mean it was joyous for me, but to be there with all those Palace fans, those South London kids. You know, a football team can do a huge amount for a sense of community. And Palace is, I say this, I know you'll say I'm biased, but I think everybody says it is a great local club. It's a great local club. It's in the heart of the community, and the outreach and the work that Palace does in that community is fantastic. The reason I'm a patron, of course, isn't because they think I'm anything great. It's because Oasis and Palace work together on 4 very large projects, actually. It's honorary. I'm not on the board or anything, but I work on Palace things every day of my life. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes, as I said, I've been to your ground just once and I had the pleasure of seeing you beat my team. So thanks for that. Thanks for reminding me, because we've achieved nothing apart from winning the Anglo-Scottish Cup since I've been supporting them. Beat that and the Gloucester Cup. Question 5. What has been your most embarrassing moment to date, please, Steve?
Well, there have been loads of them, but the most embarrassing moment recently this year is we're doing some work with a university. Have you heard the name of Tony Campolo?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Tony was a really good friend of mine. And at the end of last year, he died, sadly, just ahead of his 90th birthday. But I was doing some work with his university, Eastern University in Philadelphia, and we were preparing for his 90th birthday. And some work that's going to grow out of that, a joint project between us, which will be ongoing across the next few years, many years, I hope. But because he died before his birthday, we got together and had a celebration of Tony on his birthday, or just after his birthday. So I went back there this year and they rang me before I went, because we were going to do various things. And they said, would I stay for a golf day? Now, I am a lousy golf player. I play golf, but I am rubbish. I mean, I am really rubbish. To be good at golf, or to be half good at golf, you need to play once a week, don't you, or something like that. You need to be able to remember what you can do with the 9 and the 2 and the 3, and how far you can get the ball with a 4 or a 5, and, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of technique with a putter. Well, I learn all those things and then I forget, so every time I play, I get good not good, less than absolutely useless by the 18th hole. And then I forget it all. So I haven't played for a year. And they said, but I said, I can't play. And they said, no, you must come. You must come. You'll be good. I said, no, I won't. And anyway, and we did this fantastic American course that's used by pros. And we went round. I must have been picked with the draw with the 3 best golfers on the course. They all turned up with all the right gear and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, when you tee off, you get the pro slot and then the men's slot and then the women's slot. In other words, if you're a pro, you've got to hit it further. The men, because they're bigger, they've got their tee point. And then the women further forward. Well, they all started on the pro point by hole 2, because they've been standing round so long for me each time. They said, why don't you go on the men's thing? So that's embarrassing, isn't it? Like they're all the kind of, and then I'm going to, and by the way, one of them was a woman. She was teeing off from the pro slot. I'm on the men's slot. And after about hole 6, they said, I think you should start from the women's. And then in the end, I said to them, do you think I should start from the green? As you know, a game of golf goes on absolutely hours and hours, especially if you play with me. Every hole was an utter embarrassment, as they do it a par 4 or a par 5, and I do 20.
I hear your pain.
At least they never invite me again for that.
Well, you never know. By the way, what was the golf course? Just to make me feel even more envious.
And I knew you were going to ask me that. In fact, I can't remember because that's how bad I am at golf, but they were just clearing away all the stands because everybody had been playing there the week before. So it's in Philadelphia.
Oh.
And if you're a keen golfer, somebody will work it out. The television was moving out, the stands were moving out, and I'm glad they left before they saw me.
Well, you never know. They might find some footage and send it to us. That'd be interesting. Thank you, Steve, for those answers. From what you have achieved so far, it's no mean feat. It really isn't. I mean, we've made reference already to the Oasis Academies.
Yeah.
Why did you want to go into the academy line, especially, after everything else you'd achieved prior to that?
Well, the story is the one I was telling earlier, or beginning to tell earlier. I grew up in South London. My dad Indian, my mum English. He came here and he'd often say that the invitation, come over to Britain, help us rebuild, was a lot better than the welcome. The invitation was better than the welcome. And I think that the West Indian community found that. We all know the story of the Windrush. There was an Indian version of that as well. And so he arrived and found it hard to get work. He eventually got manual work. He eventually ended up as a ticket collector for British Rail and the station just around the corner from where we lived. So my mum had left education very early and became a housewife. So we had very little money. I grew up with my brother and two sisters it was brilliant, so I'm not moaning about it. We never went on holiday, never went in a restaurant. No one ever came round for dinner. We had no heating, no central heating, anything. We had a fire in the front room and a paraffin heater. The toilet was outdoors to start with, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
My mum and dad never had a bank account. My mum got one when she was very elderly, which we got for her, but they never had a bank account. They used to put the money in tins on the mantelpiece. Yeah. Never had a car, et cetera, et cetera. So I grew up in that poverty. It was real poverty, genuinely real poverty. Never had any new clothes. They were all secondhand from somewhere. But it was brilliant. I'm not moaning about it.
Yeah.
Telling you the story of why I started schools. And the other thing is that because my dad was a very dark-skinned South Indian, and everybody now thinks I've just got a good suntan. But when I was a kid, my nickname was Half Caste. Everybody called me Half Caste. And I saw raw prejudice and discrimination against my dad because he was very dark-skinned. Real prejudice against him. I grew up living with racism and living with poverty. Yeah. So I didn't even know it was poverty, to tell you the truth, because it was just life. And I didn't even, I guess, know it was racism. It was just the way things were. Anyway, I went to a dump of a school. I failed the 11 plus. It was a dump of a school because it was in those days when you passed the 11 plus, it was still the leftover, even though this disappeared. You were being prepared for leadership. Or you failed the 11 plus and you were being prepared then for life on the production line or, the building site or whatever. And so I never did any O levels. But the equivalent of GCSEs, never did them, weren't given the opportunity. And we were always told we wouldn't amount to much. Then when I was 14, I fell in love with this girl called Mary Hooper.
Hello, Mary, if you're listening.
I still know her. She lives in Canada now.
Oh.
Yeah. And she used to go to a youth club at Homesdale Road Baptist Church, which is right near the Palace Ground. I lived at one end of the Palace Ground. And so I started going on Friday night. I went with some other boys, my friends, and we'd all stand at one end of the hall and the girls would stand at the other end and you'd all kind of, ogle at one another, but not have the courage to talk to them, that kind of thing. And it was table tennis and this. Anyway, Mary Hooper was absolutely stunningly beautiful. And I think I ogled at her too much because one Friday she sent her mate across, Carol, to tell me that Mary thought I was ugly. Well, because teenagers are blunt, aren't they? Like, they tell you the way it is.
Yeah.
And that night, I stumbled home from this youth club and just this short walk past Palace football ground, actually. And I thought, my life's over. Mary Hooper doesn't fancy me. What is the point?
Yeah.
And then I thought, I'm never going to that church youth group again because it's so embarrassing. But then I had another thought, and it was the story they tell you down at that church youth group is a lot better than the one my school tells me. At my school, they tell me I'm thick. Down at the church, they tell me I'm made by God and my life's got potential. And then I decided I would go next week anyway, just brazen it out with Mary. And then I decided this bigger thing. I thought, well, if I'm going to go back to the church, I'm going to go back to the church because get a better story. So I'm going to be a Christian, whatever one of those is. And if I'm getting in for a penny, in for a pound, they've got a great story. I'll become a church leader when I grow up. And then I was walking on, and it was only like the length of a football pitch, this journey. I decided when I grow up, I'm going to start a school that's worth going, unlike mine, which isn't worth going to. And I'm going to start a house for kids to live in who no one cares for, because I had friends who were kind of looked after, fostered, as they call it. And I knew that was a struggle for them in some cases. And I'm going to start a hospital when I grow up. And so I got in. My dad was out doing ticket collecting on the railways. My mum was there. She said, have you had a nice evening? I didn't tell her about Mary because it was embarrassing. I said, yeah, I'm going to be a Christian. I'm going to become a church leader when I grow up. And I'm going to start a school and a house and a hospital. And she said, very nice. She had no idea about any of these things, what they meant. I wasn't talking to someone who said, oh, yes, well, I've started several of those and I can help. I mean, she'd left school very early and didn't understand, and nor did I. But as Mark Twain once said, great quote, he said, there are only two important days in your life, the day you're born and the day you find out why. And I thank God all the time that at the age of 14, I found out why. Because it's a gift. You know, you can't invent it. You can't make it up. You can't convince yourself of something that you don't believe in your inner core. It came from outside of me. It was God's gift of grace to me. So that from that day on, I have always known what my life's about. I may not have been very good at delivering it, but I've known what my true north is and where I should be going. And that's been my guide.
Where were your parents faith-wise at this time when you made this momentous decision walking past the football ground?
They used to take us to church on a Sunday morning at the church where the youth group was. And it was as boring as hell. You know, it really was. You know, you used to count the tiles and the organ pipes and all that kind of stuff. You know, we were kids. I hadn't got a clue what they were going, and we had to sit on a pew between my dad at one end and my mum at the other end, and we were all sandwiched in the middle. So it was pretty miserable. In fact, I would have described Sunday as the worst day of the week because that was it. And then we went to Sunday school in the afternoon. So it was pretty miserable, it has to be said. My mum and dad were Christians and went to church. After I became a Christian and set out on the course that I was on, my mum particularly became massively involved in the local church. They always went to services, but suddenly she took on the women's group and she'd do the lunches. And my mum was the most active person I've ever met in my life. She always was hardworking. Yeah.
Well, thank you, because we can now see a bigger picture why you went and did what you did. And I don't want to get into the controversial stuff at all, which some people say, oh, you've got to ask this, because I don't want to do that. I'd rather fly the flag for what you've done, but I'd be more interested in why. And so for me personally, as someone's very, very sensitive, if you weren't a Christian and you did all this, I doubt if you'd had any feedback at all other than, well done, Steve. But the fact you're a Christian, it seems as if other Christians could then have a go at you. How do you cope with people that want to then throw, say, a Bible verse at you? Oh, well, it says in the Bible such and such. How do you cope with it?
Well, what I'd say on two levels. First of all, the Bible can't be read. It has to be studied. So if I were to sit you, Martin, or anybody in front of one of Shakespeare's texts 400 years ago, written in English, and ask you to explain it and understand it, you couldn't unless you'd studied it. You've got to study that in order to understand it. The metaphors, the meaning, the culture it was written into, the verse, etc. What we do is we take a set of 66 books written across the course of at least 1,000 years. The Bible isn't a book, of course, is it? It's a library, which is why it's called the Bible, you know, and it's got books in it. And some of these books were written in the Middle Bronze Age, and there's a progression in them. And none of us believe everything that's written in the Bible.
I can just hear Mr. Angry from Tunbridge Wells getting out his pen.
Well, of course, Mr. Angry from Tunbridge Wells, I lived in Tunbridge for a while. Well, Mr. Angry from Tunbridge Wells will say that. And then I say, well, you know, Paul's advice in Titus that everybody born on the island of Crete, all Cretans are liars and cheats. Well, I've been to Crete on a holiday and I met some pretty nice Cretans, to tell
I
you.
have too.
Yeah. And then they say, oh, yeah, but he was quoting one of a Greek poet, which he was. But after the quote, he then adds his own comment, and this is true. Obviously, Paul had had a bad time on Crete. But I think that everybody who was born on Crete is made in God's image, which is why I chose Genesis chapter 1. Because Genesis chapter 1, its great revelation is that every man and every woman is God's representative, not just the king. Genesis 1, it's a satirical take on something that was called a Numa Ellis, the Babylonian creation story. If you read the Babylonian creation story, and which you can read online, by the way, you can Google it, read it, you'll discover that the Babylonian creation story sounds very like Genesis chapter 1. And it's because it was written a long time before Genesis chapter 1, because Babylon was the superpower and everybody knew this story. But it was about the gods hating humans and only the king being made in the image of Marduk, who was the Babylonian god. And Genesis chapter 1 is about how God makes earth not out of anger and people not because they're going to be slaves, but out of love and beauty, and keeps saying, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good, and then makes men and women. Let us make them in our image, male and female, make them in our image. We often say that you are made in the image of God. I am made in the image of God. That's not what the Bible says, actually. I'm not disputing it's true, but it's not what Genesis says. Genesis says we are made in the image of God. And of course, God is a community. Let us make them in our image. God is a community. And I'd say, we all say God is love. Well, how can God possibly be love unless God has another to love? You can only be love if you love. So if God is eternal, how was God love if there was none other to love? God is a community. Let us make God. Let us make them in our image. And when we talk about the Trinity, which is a later concept, of course, but when we talk about the Trinity, we talk about God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. We're talking again about the fact that God is social. God is a community, and a community of difference, Father, Son, and Spirit, not three sons hanging around on the corner. In other words, that's a club. Often you'll find a church which is made up of one group or the other, one age group, one viewpoint, etc. If you read the New Testament, you find Paul never considered that a church. He only writes to groups that have diversity, Jews and Gentiles in, for instance. Paul never even goes to see, let alone writes to, just a Jewish group or just a Gentile group. It's about the coming together. We are made in the image of God. So as I engage in loving another, I become more like God. God is love and is community. And in community, we find ourselves and we find God looking into the eyes of the other. That's all in Genesis chapter 1. And once you got that sorted out, I'll put it to you that half the church hasn't caught up with that. The half of the church that still won't let women lead, won't let them preach, only if there's a bloke on the stage, or etc. And then there's kind of elements of the church that won't let any women into any kind of leadership. And half the Church of England is really upset because we just got a female Archbishop of Canterbury. And I say to them all, read Genesis chapter 1.
You ought to live in Northern Ireland because it's perfect over here.
So that's why my views are inclusive. Yeah, that's why it's as I understand the biblical text. Yeah. And how do I cope with people who throw stones at you, kind of thing, metaphorically?
Yeah.
Well, I came over to Ireland, actually, to Belfast years ago, and there was
Northern Ireland, please.
Oh yeah, Northern Ireland.
Thank
I
you.
came over to Northern Ireland. I went to speak in that big hall in Belfast. What's it called?
It's quite a few.
Yeah.
The Ulster Hall.
The Ulster Hall. I went to speak in the Ulster Hall. And there was a group of people outside with banners and leaflets telling people to not go in and listen to me. And it's a kind of like, anyway, I nipped out. I found this in more than one context, because sometimes when we develop in school, people against it and they stand outside with banners. And what I always do is I nip out to the people who are protesting about me and ask if I can take my picture with them. So I went outside the Ulster Hall. I stood there and I said, "Look, this is so kind of you to do this. Could I just have a picture with you?" And they're so flabbergasted, they actually do a picture. So you stand there in a picture. I've got several of those. In other words, I understand. We are all where we are on a journey. And so I'd say to you, Martin, do you hope to learn anything and gain in wisdom and grace over the next 5 years?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you learned anything over the last 5 years about your...
Yes.
So your faith has changed. It's evolved,
Yes.
developed. So the truth is, I realize that I'm stuck on some things, and I hope that I will be more graceful and would have learned a deeper level of spirituality over the coming years, if I'm given the coming years. But I know that I've learned much over the 5 years or 10 years previously. So when they're stuck on something, I don't feel a sense of judgment for them. I really don't, because I know I've got all my own little hang-ups. I know that on this thing, I've journeyed further than them, but they'll journey further on. And, who am I to make that judgment? Jesus once said...
Oh, don't bring him into it, because
I'm sure you know, he said, love your enemy. Yeah. And then you think, if you're going to have a guess, love your enemy. And then you think, love your enemy because it really upsets them. Love your enemy, rise above who they are. But he didn't say that. Jesus said, love your enemy because in doing so, you become like your heavenly Father. And I've realized this. There's one of the things I've learned, doesn't mean I can always do it, is that when I cross the room and engage with someone who I've kind of written off for some reason, something happens in me. I have to confront my prejudice. When I reach out and shake hands with and sit or have a cup of coffee with, or whatever it is, someone who I've previously not known or not had time for, I'm having to do the hard work of overcoming my prejudice. I have to look into the dark little bits of my soul. I have to confront who I am, and I grow through that. There's a Quaker saying, and it says, an enemy is a friend you've not met yet. They're clever people, those Quakers.
Yeah, they are, aren't they? And they make great porridge jokes as well.
They do.
Yeah, I'm learning all the time. But what you're saying, well, obviously is very good. But if you look back to how you started your faith, especially with Mary Hooper in the distance, what's the single biggest thing you've learned, do you think, in all these years?
I've learned that life before death is more important than life after death, and is the focus of Jesus' teaching. So the gospel I was born into in the church was basically give your life to Jesus, say the prayer, because it's a great insurance policy. You might have to sit through some pretty awful, boring church services, but it's going to pay off in the end. You're going to go to the good place, not the bad place. What would happen to you if you died tonight? Where would you be? All of those kind of questions. Yeah. So that was the kind of faith I was born into. And I don't know about this. I really don't. But for some reason, I kind of believed it and didn't believe it. I never believed it, but I did believe it. I was a teenager, so I was confused. But I go back to my mum and dad, you see. I grew up in poverty. I saw racism. I saw people who wouldn't come to our house while my dad was in. I knew what it was to have little or nothing. And I saw the great example of my parents. And so I think somehow there was a counter narrative running in my head that what Jesus was about was creating inclusion. Jesus, as I often say to my Anglican friends, I know he wasn't an Anglican. I know he wasn't a member of the Church of England or a Catholic for that matter. But I would say, because if he'd have been an Anglican, he'd have left us with several prayers for every day of the year, a whole prayer book full of prayers. Jesus only ever told his followers one prayer. That's it. And I'm like, is that all there is? We can't fill a book with that. And it's a short one. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And we do all that bit before he talks about forgiving debtors and forgiveness. And we somehow mistranslate some of that anyway, and asking for our food. We start by simply praying, Father, you live in a dimension of love, heaven, because Jesus said, don't look for heaven here or there. It's amongst you. Live in that dimension. Our Father who is in the dimension of heaven, your kingdom come, your kingship, your rulership, your way of doing things come in our dimension on earth. That's a prayer, and it's a call. It's a call to service, isn't it? It's a call to service. And I think, though I couldn't articulate it probably like I just did, and perhaps you don't think I articulated it very well then, but I somehow knew that was about more than what happened to me after I died. I somehow knew that it was about the here and now. And that, I think, is why I made those decisions when I was 14, probably. And it's the reason why my life has gone the way it's gone. I'm not claiming to be anything great, honestly. I know what my true north is. I know what I should be heading for each day. I'm not saying I stay on course, but when I'm off course, at least I know that I'm off course. If you don't know where you're going, you never know whether you're lost or not.
Thank you. It reminds me as a 3-year-old, and I can show you the photograph afterwards, that all I ever wanted to be was a radio presenter. So firstly, thank you, because with Radio Cracker,
Yay.
There was I in insurance as an insurance sales trainer. From that, eventually I went to UCB, and the rest is history. So thank you for that. I don't know how many people want to thank you because I went on there. I know what it's like, and I still do it now, even though I've got a very seriously ill wife, and I'm still trying to do these podcasts because I believe that's what God's called me to do. But I know throughout my whole life, I've been holding on at times to Jesus with my fingernails. What have you experienced of that holding on and thinking, well, I just want to give up? Because I know I have, and yet amazingly enough, I haven't.
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic thing, isn't it? I think that for me, it goes back to this sense that I said came from outside myself. I didn't invent the idea that you should be a church leader and start a school or a house or a hospital, healthcare, whatever. It didn't come from me. It came from outside of me. That's why I described it as a gift that was given to me. Over the years, I've learned, as Oasis has expanded, we have about 6,000 staff in the UK and then lots of staff in other countries around the world. Over the years, I've learned that you can't convince yourself of your calling. If you have a bright idea, a good idea about something that you want to do, when it gets cold, when it's the winter, when the wind's against you, when life's tough, when finance is short, when friends walk out on you, when you can't rely on what you thought was stable, in the end, you will give up. But the reason you'll give up is simply because it didn't mean everything to you. But for me, I was given this gift, this compulsion. People say to me regularly, why don't you take it easier? Why don't you just step back? Well, I've stepped back from thousands of things in Oasis, literally. I mean, well, hundreds and hundreds of things. But I'm compelled by this calling that's not about me. And that has kept me going. And pretty well, it's kept me on the straight and narrow as well, if you see. But I hope not too narrow. But somebody once said to me years ago, 2 things which I think are relevant to what you say. First of all, well, this is something I've learned the first thing myself, that vision is actually the same thing as frustration. So if you've got a vision, what does that mean? It means if you've got a vision for something, you pray for it, you long for it, you dream of it. It's your goal. It never gets out of your head. There's this longing and an aching for this thing because it's vision. That's what a vision is. What is frustration? It is longing and aching and praying and hoping for something that is not yet. So vision and frustration are in actual fact the same thing. If you've got vision, you will live with frustration, and sometimes it will be like breaking. But frustration is the downside of vision. The 2 things go together. And I often say, and I think about myself, if I'm sitting in a chair, metaphorically in life, I'm holding a chair in a job where I'm not frustrated, then I should leave it. give up and give it to someone because I'm wasting the chair. I should hand it over to someone who'll sit in it and will be frustrated, because it's frustration that makes progress. And then the other thing I heard someone say this, I worked that thing out over years and years for myself, but I heard someone say years ago, the trouble with vision is that it's an incurable disease. There's no way out of it. There's no way out of it. You can't escape it. And none of that is to hold anybody to anything, but those are principles that I've found in my life. It has to be said, I've also been accompanied on this journey by loads of wonderful people. But what they'd say to me is it's the vision that I have given to them that has meant they could stick it and walk the pathway with me.
Yeah.
And the vision is born in them. And one of the things that pleases me most about Oasis is I do know this. If I snuff it now, which would be a bit embarrassing for you, Martin, because
I don't know. I can make lots of money out of it.
Oops, an abrupt end. He's just fallen off his chair.
Oh, last ever podcast. Oh!
But apart from that, the truth is, tomorrow morning, every Oasis school open again. Every Oasis youth club community centre will open again. Every Oasis housing project will open again. Oasis work in every country we work in will open again. So it's now beyond me anyway.
Yeah.
In one sense, I don't matter to it, which is great feeling.
Thank you. So for those that are listening today, because, we call it off-grid Christianity because I really felt that's what God told me to call it. I'm not going to argue because I think he's slightly bigger than me and he might sort of win in a boxing match. For those that are holding on by their fingertips and they're thinking, I'm so close to just giving it all up, what would you say to them?
I would say, actually, I've got loads of friends who've given up. Often we give up on a God that doesn't exist. So, for instance, we've been taught that if we just pray about a thing, it'll sort out. Or we've been taught that, if something happens, it's all God's will, it's all God's timing. Or we've been taught that if someone dies, it's because the Lord needed them more than us. Their work on earth was done. It was their time. I don't believe any of that. I think it's all crap, to tell you the truth. And what very often happens is we're sold a lie and then it doesn't work out. We're sold a kind of black and white version of Christianity that isn't true. Bad stuff happens. Most of the Bible, Old and New Testament, is written to people who were in exile or who were slaves or were living under the curse of a conqueror. That applies to the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, what we know as the Old Testament, and the New Testament. It was written to people who were living under persecution and hardship. They didn't go on holidays and have weekends off, etc., etc., etc. So it was written into that. And we all follow a man who was crucified, executed for what he believes. My life's going pretty well compared with all of that. I've never been a slave. I'm not in exile. I can't afford to go on a holiday. And so far, when people say, they've crucified you about your inclusion of LGBT people, for instance, I always think, well, they've not really. They've just written some nasty things about me. That doesn't matter. I haven't come close to being crucified for my faith, but the man I follow was.
I can't remember where I read this, but Christian seems to be getting a bad word in certain circles. And I think it was last week, especially with some politicians who like to say, all of a sudden, that they're a Christian. And they say we maybe should change the word to Jesus follower instead, because that will set us apart.
Yeah. In fact, that's what I often say to people. I've said it. I've just been in a conversation with a High Court judge this afternoon. And I was explaining to them, I'm a follower of Jesus. Into the conversation, I didn't slap it on her. I said, I'm a follower of Jesus. I follow Jesus' teaching because it's made a meaning of my life. Everybody needs meaning. Everybody needs purpose in life. And the purpose for me came through following Jesus. And we describe Oasis as a Christ-centered organization. We don't describe it as a Christian organization, because Christian means anything you like, doesn't it? Let's be honest. I mean, anything you like. And worse than that, the term evangelical means everything you don't like, doesn't it? I mean, it really does. I'd say I consider myself a good news bringer. I grew up in evangelical Christianity. I consider myself still an evangelical, if you like. I do. Loads of people say I'm not. and all that who are Christians. But I consider myself a good news bringer. I think evangelicalism has brought a lot of bad news to a lot of people. As we all know, that's not my view. You just got to read the papers. You got to open your eyes to what has happened. And so the term has been dirtied, and therefore we got to be careful. I tell you that I would still consider myself an evangelical Christian in the sense that the evangel, of course, is the bringing of good news. And I hope I'm bringing good news. I pray God's the only judge of that I'm bringing good news to somebody I sit next to and get chatting to on a train, or the lady or judge I talked to this afternoon, or whoever it might be. I'm going to celebrate someone's birthday tonight. I pray I'm a good news bringer and not a bad news bringer. But forms of evangelicalism have dirtied the word, and forms of Christianity have dirtied that term even.
Yes.
And so that's why we say we're Christ-centered. And then people ask us, what does that mean? And say, our ambition is to live by Christ's character. In fact, we've got 9 habits that undergird everything Oasis does, from schools to housing to justice projects to whatever it is in this country, around the world. The Oasis 9 habits. And the Oasis 9 habits are actually the fruit of the Spirit, because we employ people of all sorts of faiths and backgrounds and no faith, as well as Christians. And they say, where do these 9 habits come from? And why is it 9? That's a funny number. And I always say, well, there's this guy, lived a long time ago. He's called Paul. He was about 6 years, perhaps 10 years, between 6 and 10 years younger than Jesus. And he was fascinated by Jesus, but he had some mates, and they lived in an area called Galatia. And so he wrote a note to them. Funny enough, the note never got lost, and it's in the Bible now, and we call it the book of Galatians, or the letter to the Galatians. But in his note to his mates, he describes Jesus' character, and he does it in 9 words, which he calls the fruit of living that spiritual life, the fruit of living a life in the dimension of heaven. And what we've done is we've taken those 9 characteristics, and we call them the Oasis 9 habits. That's where it comes from.
Wow.
So we introduce that to everybody as they go down the line, and they love it. They love it. And then we say, when Paul described these 9 characteristics, he said it's the fruit. He didn't say it's the fruits, because if you're going to be someone who is humble, you can't say, well, I'm not very compassionate, but I'm quite humble. It's kind of like, this is a package. It comes together, and it comes together through chasing the example of Jesus.
Thank you. Just in a few more minutes, we'll find out who your Christian hero is, someone who's inspired you. But you mentioned the great Tony Campolo. I had the privilege of meeting him twice. Last month, I interviewed Shane Claiborne, who you obviously know as well.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to play golf with either of them, just saying.
Shane's not a great golfer. No, it's Tony.
But he could talk a good game though, couldn't he? Could you just imagine that? So one of the things that Tony has said that I really hold on to, and you've most probably heard it hundreds of times, when he gets to heaven, Jesus at the pearly gates, and says, but have you clothed the poor? Have you fed the hungry? Have you done this? No, but I led a church service every Sunday morning for 10 years. What do you think Jesus will say to you when you get up there, apart from, well done, good and faithful servant, which is what I'm hoping you'll say to me?
I think in one sense, I'm not in the least bit interested. And I don't mean that disrespectfully at all.
No.
I think my task is to build the kingdom of God here. And, God knows my innermost thought. He knows my motivation, etc., etc. I'll tell you a funny story about Tony. I'd got to know Tony very well over the years. I was very fortunate. I heard him speak. First time I heard him speak, when I must have been 25, I guess. And I heard this guy speak. He's a Baptist minister, Tony. And I thought, that's extraordinary. I've listened to a lot of Baptist ministers in my life. 3 points, you're drifting off by the end of the second one. Why is it always 3 points beginning with P in this kind of thing, or F, or whatever it is? And here was Tony, and he was like explosive. In fact, I often used to say to Tony, the first time I heard him speak, I was just willing him to stop. And it wasn't because I was bored. It was because it was so motivating. I wanted to go out and do something about it. And I'd go like, stop. I just want to get out there and do something. Stop going on. So I could hear. He was that motivated. Anyway, very fortunately, I got to know Tony, because what happened was, I'll tell you the story because it's relevant. I was booked to speak at this big event in Africa, in Harare. in Zimbabwe. And Tony was. I was speaking one night and Tony was speaking on another night. I agreed to go because I'd never been asked to speak anywhere abroad before. And I thought, wow, I'm going to be an international Christian speaker. Like I was so pleased with myself.
Yeah.
I must have been like 30 or something. I can't remember. And then Tony was there. And when I told Tony, I'm on the same bill as Tony Campolo. Anyway, what happened was one night Tony spoke. There were about 10,000 people at this thing. And Tony spoke on this huge stage, and he was as brilliant as ever, so deep, yet so funny and, so engaging and loads of great stories. And I thought, oh, boy, he's so brilliant. The next morning, I was in the speaker's lounge place, and I saw him in the corner. Now, I kind of knew him to say hello to, but that was it. And I wandered over and I sat down next to him with a cup of coffee or whatever. And I said, Tony, it's lovely to see you. Do you mind me interrupting? He said, no, sit here. I said, look, I've got an issue. He said, what's that? I said, well, the issue is I'm here for all the wrong reasons. I said, my head is so full and so proud that I'm speaking at an international event. I said, it's terrible. Like all my motives are shot. And they're even more shocked because I'm speaking at an international event with you. So I know I can't speak tonight. I know I shouldn't. I know it's totally wrong. I need to get myself sorted out. But I'm not doing this for Jesus. I'm just doing it because, I'm going to be an international speaker. And I can't get that thought out of my head. So I said, I wonder if we could go and see the organisers. And why don't you speak again tonight? Because they love it. And I can just tell them the truth and they'll understand why I can't. So Tony looks at me, and I don't know what you'd say to people in that situation. Like, oh, yes, Steve, you really should repent. Shall we pray about it now? Like, it's good that you've confessed it to me, but let's sit and talk about why you're such an egotist and how you kind of like all that kind of stuff. Tony looked at me and he could bark. He said, if you think that I'm going to stand on that stage instead of you, I can't remember his exact words, you've got another thing coming. And if you think that God's in the least bit interested in your mixed up, muddled up motives and life, what on earth do you believe? He said, this is all far more important than you. Get up on that stage and tell people what the truth is. Get up on that stage and tell them what they need to know and leave it to God to sort you out. Kind of like, so he said, I am not speaking instead of you, but I'll sit at the back if you like, and we'll have a cup of coffee about it tomorrow morning. And that was brilliant advice because we've all got mixed up, muddled up motives. And most people would have corrected me. But Tony knew enough about himself and enough about life to encourage me. And that bound us together, actually. And we became good friends. And even when Tony was ill for the last 5 years of his life, he'd had a serious stroke. Cornelia, my wife, and I, we went to see Tony and Peggy, his wife. We spent the new year with them, actually, the few months before his stroke, the new year, and he had a stroke in the June. He lived in a care home for 5 years. And each year I used to go and stay a few days, just go and live in the care home with him and sit and talk with him. I love Tony. I owe so much to him in terms of the development of my theology, my sociology, because he was a sociologist rather than a theologian. That's what he was, a doctor of sociology, a great theologian and a brilliant communicator. But I'll tell you the best thing about Tony, he loved people. He wasn't one thing on a stage and another thing in the rest of life. So I learned so much from Tony, and I had the privilege when he died, they invited me and I went to speak. Shane was there, he led some prayers. They asked me to speak at his huge Thanksgiving memorial service. And one of the other people that came, there were 3 speakers, me and 2 others, and one of the others was Hillary Clinton. And Hillary came and she spoke. And everybody knows that Tony Campolo helped Bill, when he had a wobbly patch. But actually, Hillary, and I spent an hour sitting with her in a room before it started, but she said to everyone, Tony and Peggy had helped them through life. They already knew Tony. It wasn't that, let's get a preacher in. They knew Tony. They trusted him. They loved him because he gave time to everyone, absolutely everyone. Great example to me. I've taken us way off track there.
Not at all. Thank you for sharing that about Tony. And for those that are listening today and say, well, I don't really know much more about Tony. Well, we did a tribute to him about 30, 40 podcasts ago featuring people from Britain, predominantly who were really, really important in bringing Tony over. Peter Meadows, Steve Goddard, people like that, Ash Barker from Australia. They share what it was like to know him. And in the early days, please have a listen because it is so encouraging. Steve, listen, thank you so much. You've got a birthday party to go to, so I shall raise a glass myself tonight to your friend. But in the meantime, it's drum roll time, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The Reverend Steve Chalke, who is, please, your Christian hero?
Well, I would say, and I never met this man, Nelson Mandela. And the reason I'll tell you this is this is an example of it. We work with kids who've been convicted of violent crime. That's one of the Oasis projects. A court can sentence a young person to us and we work with them therapeutically. And just a couple of months ago, I was with some young people who'd committed some very violent crimes. And I'd spent the afternoon with them playing pool and the morning playing five-a-side football with them. No fouls, anything.
With your Crystal Palace shirt on.
And in the evening, we sat down because they're with us in a secure establishment, so they can't go home. They're sentenced to us. And in the evening, I sat down and they said, what should we watch? And I said, hey, why don't we watch something about Nelson Mandela? They said, who's that? I explained it. And then we found a BBC hour documentary about Nelson. It was a serious documentary. And these three teenage lads sat there with me. And the reason I showed them that, and they loved it, and we talked about it afterwards, is Nelson Mandela was a violent man. And he went to prison on Robben Island initially and then elsewhere. He went to prison, as he would say, as someone committed to violence, not to killing people, but committed to blowing things up. He was committed to violence. And on that island, in living in solitary confinement, that little cell, through those years, he tamed himself and he found God in a real way. And he emerged from prison as a world leader, as a man of peace and a world leader. He went in messed up. He came out presidential material. And so I was able to say to those lads with me, so you're here serving sentences, but use this time like Nelson used his time. You can become leaders. Nelson Mandela is an extraordinary example of someone who allowed Christ to slowly change him as he followed. And that's why he became who he became.
Fantastic answer. And I always remember how he was wearing his business suit in the Rugby World Cup and he takes off his jacket to reveal the Springboks shirt.
Yeah.
How many politicians would even have thought of doing that? Nelson did, and he did. Amazing. Steve, thank you very much, Steve, for all your time today. And yes, have a lovely birthday party celebration with your friend tonight. Thank you so much for joining us on Off Grid Christianity.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin.
God bless. Bye-bye. And if you haven't already hit the like and subscribe button, please do. It means a lot. Thank you. Next time on Off Grid Christianity, what else would you like to say about fallibility, please?
I think that in the way that the Bible teaches and that God loves everyone equally, we're all equally fallible. So whether we have different positions of power and wealth doesn't change that. And I think if we hang on to that, particularly those people who have got important positions, which are very difficult to manage, I'm sure. I'm just an armchair critic. I think that's what God wants from us. He wants us to never believe that we are more important than we are, but always remember that we are worth much more than perhaps we think we are.
So please join me with published author and retired social worker, teacher, and also philosopher, Nathan Driscoll. And wow, what a thought-provoking podcast it is. Until then, cheerio.